Picture this. You've spent 35 years building someone else's empire while your own dreams collected dust in forgotten folders. You've smiled through countless business dinners, organized family gatherings, and held everything together with the quiet strength that nobody ever notices. Then one evening, at what should be your moment of celebration, the person you've devoted your entire adult life to looks you in the eye and says the words that shatter everything you believed about your marriage. I didn't love you for 35 years, Elena. You were just convenient. What would you do? How would you respond when the foundation of your entire existence crumbles in a single sentence? This is exactly what happened to Elena Martinez, and her response will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, sacrifice, and the courage it takes to reclaim your life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Elena Martinez had always been the architect of other people's dreams, quite literally. At 25, fresh out of Arizona State's architecture program, she had been brimming with ideas for sustainable housing projects that could transform Phoenix's rapidly expanding landscape. Her portfolio was filled with innovative designs that merged modern living with desert conservation, plans that respected the natural beauty of the Sonoran landscape, while creating homes that felt both luxurious and environmentally conscious. She had secured her first major client, a forward-thinking developer who wanted to create an eco-friendly subdivision in what was then the outskirts of Scottsdale. The project would have established her reputation and launched the kind of career she had dreamed about since childhood, when she spent hours sketching elaborate treehouses and imaginary cities in the margins of her school notebooks. But then, she met David Chen at a networking mixer for young professionals in the Phoenix area. He was 28, charming in that effortless way that some people possess, with an easy smile and the kind of confidence that made everyone in the room want to be part of whatever he was building. David had just started his own real estate development company with a small inheritance from his grandfather, and he was full of ambitious plans for transforming Phoenix's skyline. He talked about mixed-use developments, luxury resorts, and commercial complexes with the passion of someone who truly believed he could reshape the city. When he spoke, his eyes lit up with a vision that was both infectious and inspiring. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of Phoenix's stunning sunsets and the raw beauty of the desert landscape. David would pick her up in his used BMW, and they would drive out to undeveloped lots where he would point out potential building sites, his hands gesturing enthusiastically as he described the shopping centers and office buildings he planned to construct. Elena found herself drawn not just to his ambition, but to the way he seemed to see possibility everywhere he looked. She would share her own ideas about sustainable design, and he would nod thoughtfully, asking detailed questions about solar orientation and water conservation techniques that made her feel heard and valued in a way she had never experienced before. 6 months into their relationship, David's business hit its first major crisis. A key investor pulled out of a crucial project, leaving him scrambling to find alternative financing while juggling multiple deadlines and increasingly anxious contractors. Elena watched him struggle with a mixture of admiration and growing concern. He was working 18-hour days, surviving on coffee and determination, but the stress was clearly taking its toll. His easy confidence began to crack under the pressure, and she could see the fear in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. The young man who had seemed so invincible was drowning in the complexities of running a business he wasn't quite ready to handle. Without really discussing it, Elena began helping him organize his chaotic office, creating filing systems for his contracts, and developing spreadsheets to track his various projects and their timelines. She had always been naturally organized, a skill that served her well in managing complex architectural projects, and she found that she could bring order to David's business in ways that allowed him to focus on what he did best. Her background in architecture also proved invaluable when reviewing construction plans and identifying potential problems before they became expensive mistakes. What started as occasional assistance gradually evolved into something more substantial, as David began relying on her input for increasingly important decisions. The turning point came when David landed his biggest project yet, a luxury shopping complex in North Scottsdale that would require him to coordinate with multiple city departments, manage a team of contractors, and navigate the complex approval process that could make or break the entire venture. The project was exactly the kind of opportunity that could establish his company as a major player in Phoenix's competitive development market, but it was also far more complex than anything he had attempted before. Elena could see that he was overwhelmed by the sheer scope of what he was trying to accomplish, and she found herself spending more and more time at his office, helping him prepare presentations, review contracts, and coordinate with the various professionals whose expertise the project required. It was during one of those late nights at his office, when they were working together to finalize a crucial proposal that would determine whether the project moved forward, that David turned to her with an expression of gratitude and something deeper that she couldn't quite identify. "Elena, I don't know what I would do without you," he said, his voice carrying a vulnerability that she had rarely heard from him. "You've become essential to everything I'm trying to build here, not just the business, but my whole life. I can't imagine doing any of this without you by my side." 2 weeks later, he proposed to her at the construction site of what would become their first major success together, the shopping complex that would establish Chen Development as one of Phoenix's most promising young companies. The setting was hardly romantic in any conventional sense, with construction equipment scattered around them and the skeletal framework of the building rising against the desert sky. But Elena was moved by the symbolism of beginning their marriage. At the site of what they had built together, David had chosen a beautiful ring, a classic solitaire that caught the Arizona sunset perfectly, and when he got down on one knee in the dust and construction debris, she said yes, without hesitation. Their wedding was a modest affair, held at a resort in Paradise Valley with views of Camelback Mountain providing a stunning backdrop for their vows. Elena wore her grandmother's lace dress, altered to fit her perfectly, and David looked handsome, in a navy suit that brought out the warmth in his dark eyes. The guest list included their families, close friends, and several of David's business associates who had become important connections in Phoenix's tight-knit development community. During their reception, David gave a speech thanking Elena not just for agreeing to marry him, but for becoming his partner in every sense of the word. "She's not just my wife," he told their guests. "She's the person who makes everything I do possible." For the first few years of their marriage, Elena managed to maintain her own architectural practice while also serving as David's unofficial business manager and consultant. She would work on her own projects during the day, designing custom homes for clients who appreciated her innovative approach to desert living, and then spend her evenings helping David with his increasingly complex development deals. It was an exhausting schedule, but she found satisfaction in the variety and challenge of managing both careers. Her own projects were smaller in scale than David's ambitious developments, but they allowed her to experiment with the sustainable design concepts that had always been her passion. The balance became increasingly difficult to maintain as David's company grew and his projects became more demanding. Elena found herself spending more time on Chen Development business and less time on her own architectural work. When clients called with questions about their projects, she was often in meetings with David's contractors or city planners. When she sat down to work on her own designs, her mind was occupied with David's scheduling conflicts and budget concerns. Gradually, almost without her realizing it, her own practice began to suffer as David's business consumed more and more of her time and energy. The decision to officially close her architectural firm and join David's company full-time didn't happen all at once. Instead, it evolved gradually as the practical demands of Chen Development made it increasingly difficult for Elena to maintain her own independent practice. David never explicitly asked her to give up her career, but the constant requests for help, the urgent phone calls during her own client meetings, and the growing complexity of his projects created a situation where she felt pulled in too many directions to do justice to her own work. When her last remaining client decided to postpone their project indefinitely, Elena found herself at a crossroads that felt both inevitable and heartbreaking. David was genuinely grateful when she agreed to join his company officially, creating a position for her as director of operations that came with a generous salary and significant responsibility for the day-to-day management of their projects. He made it clear that he considered her an equal partner in the business, even though his name was on the company letterhead, and he remained the public face of Chen Development. Elena threw herself into her new role with characteristic determination, developing systems and processes that helped the company handle increasingly ambitious projects with greater efficiency and professionalism. Over the years, Elena's contributions to Chen Development became so integral to the company's success that it was difficult to imagine how it could function without her. She managed relationships with contractors, coordinated with city planning, departments, oversaw budgets, and handled the countless details that kept complex development projects moving forward on schedule and within budget. Her architectural background proved invaluable in identifying design problems early and finding creative solutions that saved both time and money. She became David's most trusted advisor, the person he turned to when facing difficult decisions about new projects or challenging negotiations with investors and partners. The company prospered under their joint leadership, growing from David's small startup into one of Phoenix's most respected development firms. They built shopping centers, office complexes, and luxury residential developments throughout the valley, each project adding to their reputation and their growing financial success. Elena took pride in the quality of their work and the positive impact their developments had on the communities they served. Even though she was no longer practicing architecture in the traditional sense, she found ways. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To incorporate her design sensibilities and environmental consciousness into Chen Development's projects. Their personal life evolved alongside their professional partnership. They bought a beautiful home in Scottsdale, a contemporary Adobe-style house that Elena had designed herself as a showcase for the kind of sustainable luxury living that she had always envisioned. The house featured solar panels, xeriscaped gardens, and an open floor plan that maximized natural light while minimizing energy consumption. It was featured in Phoenix Home and Garden magazine as an example of how modern desert architecture could be both environmentally responsible and elegantly sophisticated. Elena loved their home, not just for its beauty, but for what it represented about the life they had built together. Their son Marcus was born when Elena was 31, a bright and curious child who inherited his father's confidence and his mother's attention to detail. Elena managed to balance motherhood with her responsibilities at Chen Development, though it required careful coordination and occasional help from David's mother, who had retired and was happy to spend time with. Her grandson, Marcus, grew up understanding that both his parents worked hard to build something significant, and he seemed to inherit their appreciation for the satisfaction that comes from creating something lasting and valuable. As Marcus grew older and Chen Development continued to expand, Elena found herself taking on even more responsibility for the company's operations. David focused on securing new projects and managing relationships with major investors, while Elena handled the complex logistics of actually completing the developments they committed to building. She was the person contractors called when they encountered problems on job sites. She was the one who negotiated with suppliers and coordinated with city inspectors. She managed schedules, budgets, and the countless details that could make the difference between a project's success and failure. The years passed with the comfortable rhythm of a successful marriage and a thriving business. Elena and David worked together during the day and shared dinner most evenings, discussing their son's achievements and their plans for the company's future. They took family vacations to places like Sedona and the Grand Canyon, where Marcus could experience the natural beauty of Arizona, while Elena and David scouted potential locations for future resort developments. Their marriage felt solid and purposeful, built on shared goals and mutual respect for each other's contributions to their common success. Elena sometimes missed the creative satisfaction of designing individual homes, but she found fulfillment in the broader impact of Chen Development's projects and in the knowledge that her work was essential to the company's continued growth. She told herself that she had made the right choice, that the sacrifice of her independent architectural career had been worth it for the larger success they had achieved together. When former classmates asked about her architectural practice, she would explain that she had transitioned into development work that allowed her to have a broader impact on Phoenix's growth and evolution. Their 25th wedding anniversary approached with Elena feeling genuinely grateful for the life they had built together. Chen Development was more successful than they had ever imagined it could become when David started the company with his small inheritance and big dreams. Marcus was thriving at MIT, studying engineering with the same passion for building and creating that had driven both his parents. Their marriage had weathered the usual challenges that come with balancing careers, parenthood, and the pressures of running a demanding business. But they had emerged stronger and more committed to each other. David had been working for months on plans for what he described as the most ambitious project in Chen Development's history, a luxury resort and spa in Sedona that would cater to wealthy tourists seeking a high-end desert experience. The project would require coordination with multiple investors, environmental impact studies, and navigation of Sedona's particularly complex zoning regulations. But if successful, it would establish Chen Development as a major player in Arizona's lucrative tourism industry. Elena had been heavily involved in the preliminary planning, helping David prepare presentations for potential investors and coordinating with the team of specialists whose expertise the project would require. The resort project had consumed much of their attention for the better part of a year, and Elena was looking forward to celebrating their anniversary once the initial phase of planning was complete. David had suggested they throw a party to mark both their 25th wedding anniversary and Chen Development's continued growth, inviting their friends, family, and business associates to celebrate at one of Scottsdale's most elegant resorts. Elena thought it was a wonderful idea, a chance to acknowledge both their personal and professional achievements while surrounded by the people who had supported them throughout their journey together. Elena spent weeks meticulously planning their anniversary celebration, treating it with the same attention to detail that had made her invaluable to Chen Development's success over the decades. She reserved the ballroom at the Four Seasons Resort Scottsdale, a venue that perfectly captured the elegant desert aesthetic she had always admired, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the McDowell Mountains and carefully curated artwork celebrating Arizona's natural beauty. The guest list grew to include over 100 people, representing the network of relationships they had built throughout their years in Phoenix's business community. Elena chose her outfit with particular care, selecting a deep emerald dress that complemented her still striking features and the silver that had begun threading through her dark hair. She had always been beautiful, but at 58, she possessed a kind of refined elegance that came from years of confidence and success. The dress was sophisticated without being flashy, appropriate for a woman who had learned to command respect. In rooms full of powerful men while never losing her natural grace, she paired it with the diamond earrings David had given her for their 20th anniversary, a gesture that had felt romantic at the time, but now seemed more like an acknowledgement of her value as a business partner. The preparations consumed Elena's days leading up to the event. She coordinated with the resort's catering staff to design a menu that would appeal to their diverse group of guests, balancing elegant presentations with the hearty flavors that characterized the best of Southwestern cuisine. She worked with the event coordinator to ensure that the lighting would be perfect for the photography they had planned, wanting to capture memories of what she hoped would be a milestone celebration in their shared journey. She even commissioned a small video presentation highlighting Chen Development's major projects over the years, a visual retrospective that would remind their guests of the remarkable growth they had achieved together. David seemed genuinely touched by the effort Elena was putting into their anniversary celebration, though he was often distracted by the demands of the Sedona Resort project that continued to consume much of his attention. He would compliment her choices when she showed him details about the menu or the decorations, but Elena could sense that his mind was elsewhere, focused on the complex negotiations and planning that the resort development required. She told herself that this was simply David being David, the driven entrepreneur who had built their success through relentless focus and determination. As the anniversary party approached, Elena found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. 35 years of marriage had taught her that partnerships require constant adjustment and compromise, and she felt proud of how well they had navigated the challenges that could have derailed less committed couples. The decision to give up her architectural practice still sometimes caused her a pang of regret, especially when she saw former classmates winning awards for innovative designs or reading about projects that embodied the kind of sustainable development she had once hoped to pioneer. But she reminded herself that her contributions to Chen development had made a far greater impact than anything she could have accomplished working alone. The night of their anniversary celebration arrived with perfect weather, one of those crisp, desert evenings when the sky deepens to a brilliant purple and the city lights begin to twinkle across the valley floor. Elena felt genuinely excited as she and David arrived at the resort, greeting their guests and accepting congratulations on their milestone anniversary. The ballroom looked exactly as she had envisioned it, elegant and warm, with touches of desert-inspired decoration that felt sophisticated rather than kitschy. Their friends and business associates mingled comfortably, creating the kind of atmosphere that Elena had hoped would make the evening memorable for everyone involved. David looked handsome in his navy suit, the same color he had worn to their wedding 25 years earlier, though his hair was now completely gray, and his face showed the lines that come from decades of making difficult decisions under pressure. Elena felt a surge of affection as she watched him work the room, greeting their guests with the charm and confidence that had first attracted her all those years ago. This was David at his best, she thought, surrounded by people who respected what he had built and genuinely enjoyed his company. The evening proceeded beautifully, with cocktails flowing and conversations buzzing throughout the elegantly appointed ballroom. Elena moved through their guests with practiced ease, making sure everyone felt welcomed and appreciated, while keeping an eye on the details that could make or break such an event. She chatted with the wives of David's business partners, comparing notes about their children's achievements and their own involvement in various charitable organizations throughout Phoenix. She laughed with longtime friends about shared memories and caught up with people they hadn't seen in months due to their busy schedules. When dinner was served, Elena had arranged for David and herself to sit at a table with their closest friends and most important business associates, people who had been part of their journey from the early days when Chen Development was still fighting to establish itself in Phoenix's competitive market. The conversation was lively and warm, with stories about deals that had almost fallen through, construction challenges that had tested everyone's patience, and the satisfaction that came from seeing empty lots transformed into thriving commercial centers that served their communities. Elena felt genuinely happy as she looked around the table, seeing people who had become like family over the decades of working and socializing together. These were relationships that had been built on mutual respect and shared success, and she appreciated how lucky they had been to find such a supportive community in what could be a ruthlessly competitive industry. David was animated and engaging, telling stories about their early days that made everyone laugh and reminiscing about projects that had seemed impossible at the time, but had ultimately become some of their greatest successes. As the dinner plates were cleared and the evening moved toward the speeches that Elena had planned as the highlight of their celebration, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the life they had built together. Whatever sacrifices she had made along the way seemed justified by moments like this, when she could see the tangible results of their partnership and feel the genuine affection of people who had watched them grow both personally and professionally. She had planned for David to speak first, sharing his reflections on their marriage and their business partnership, followed by a few close friends who had agreed to offer their own thoughts about the couple's journey together. David stood to address their guests, and the room gradually quieted as people turned their attention to their host. Elena felt a flutter of anticipation, curious about what David would say about their 35 years together and looking forward to hearing him acknowledge the partnership that had made their success possible. She had heard him speak at business events countless times over the years, but this felt different, more personal and meaningful than presentations to investors or speeches at industry conferences. David began with humor, making gentle jokes about the challenges of being married to someone who kept such detailed schedules and insisted on color-coded filing systems for everything related to their business. The guests laughed appreciatively, and Elena smiled at the familiar teasing that had been part of their dynamic for decades. He talked about the early days of Chen development, when they worked out of a tiny office and Elena would bring him lunch, because he was too busy to leave his desk. He mentioned some of their major projects, crediting Elena's organizational skills and attention to detail for helping him avoid the kind of costly mistakes that had derailed other developers. Elena listened with growing warmth as David continued his speech, appreciating his acknowledgement of her contributions and feeling moved by his obvious affection for the memories they had created together. This was exactly what she had hoped for from their anniversary celebration, a public recognition of their partnership, and an opportunity to reflect on what they had accomplished as a team. She began to relax and enjoy the moment, feeling grateful for the life they had built and optimistic about whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead for them. But then, David's tone shifted slightly, becoming more reflective and serious, as he moved toward what Elena assumed would be the emotional climax of his speech. He paused, looking directly at her with an expression that seemed more complicated than simple affection, and Elena felt a small flutter of uncertainty about where his remarks were heading. The room remained quiet, with their guests obviously moved by what they interpreted as David's building toward a romantic declaration of his love and gratitude for his wife of 35 years. David cleared his throat and continued speaking, his voice carrying a weight that Elena had never heard before when he talked about their relationship. He began discussing the practical aspects of their partnership, how Elena's skills had complemented his own ambitions, and how her willingness to handle the details had freed him to focus on the big-picture vision that had driven Chen Development's growth. Elena nodded along, still expecting him to transition into more personal territory, to talk about love and commitment, and the emotional foundation that had sustained their marriage through decades of challenges and triumphs. Instead, David's speech took a turn that left Elena feeling increasingly uncomfortable, as she began to sense that something was fundamentally different about the way he was describing their relationship. He talked about compatibility and mutual benefit, about how fortunate he had been to find someone whose strengths aligned so perfectly with his needs. He mentioned Elena's reliability, her competence, and her willingness to support his goals without complaint or competition. The words were complimentary, but Elena began to notice what was missing from his description of their marriage. The realization crept over Elena slowly, like the gradual recognition of a familiar melody played in an unfamiliar key. David was describing their relationship as if it were a successful business arrangement, highlighting the practical benefits and mutual advantages without ever mentioning love, passion, or the emotional connection that Elena had always believed was the foundation of their marriage. She tried to tell herself that she was overanalyzing his words, that David had never been particularly eloquent about emotional matters, and that his focus on practical aspects didn't necessarily mean anything significant about his deeper feelings. But as David continued speaking, Elena found it increasingly difficult to ignore the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong with what she was hearing. He talked about Elena as if she were an exceptionally valuable employee, someone whose contributions had been essential to his success, but whose motivations and feelings were secondary to the practical benefits she provided. The more he spoke, the more Elena felt like she was hearing about a stranger, someone who existed primarily to serve David's needs, rather than as an equal partner in a loving relationship. The moment Elena had been dreading finally arrived when David reached what was clearly intended to be the climactic point of his speech. He looked directly at her, his expression serious and what he probably thought was profound, and spoke the words that would shatter everything Elena believed about their marriage and her own worth as a human being. His voice carried across the silent ballroom with devastating clarity as he said, "Elena, I need to be honest about something that I think our friends should understand about our relationship. I didn't love you for 35 years. You were just convenient." The silence that followed was deafening, as if the entire room had collectively held its breath while trying to process what they had just heard. Elena felt the blood drain from her face as the words hit her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her stunned and disoriented in a way that made it difficult to believe what had just happened. She looked around the table at their guests, seeing confusion and discomfort on faces that had been warm and celebratory just moments before. The elegant ballroom that had felt so perfect suddenly seemed like a stage for her public humiliation. Elena's mind raced as she tried to understand not just what David had said, but why he had chosen this moment, in front of all their friends and business associates, to reveal something so devastating about their marriage. She felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that was almost unbearable. Sitting in her carefully chosen dress at the anniversary party she had planned with such love and attention to detail. Hearing her husband describe their entire relationship as a matter of convenience, rather than love, David seemed to realize that his words had not landed the way he had intended, and he quickly tried to soften what he had said by adding comments about Elena's many wonderful qualities and her importance to both his personal life and their business success. But Elena barely heard his attempts at clarification because the damage had already been done with a precision that felt almost surgical. Everything she had believed about their marriage, about David's feelings for her, and about her own value as a partner and companion had been undermined in a single sentence delivered in front of the people whose opinions mattered most to her. Elena forced herself to remain composed, drawing on years of experience managing difficult situations in business settings where showing weakness could be catastrophic. She smiled and nodded as David concluded his speech, even managing to stand, and accept a kiss on the cheek that felt like another betrayal given what had just transpired. The guests applauded politely, though Elena could sense their discomfort and confusion about what they had witnessed. Several people at their table exchanged glances that suggested they understood they had just seen something that went far beyond the typical awkwardness of a poorly delivered speech. As the evening continued around her, Elena found herself moving through the motions of hosting their anniversary party while feeling completely disconnected from everything that was happening. She smiled and made conversation, accepted congratulations on their marriage, and thanked people for coming to celebrate with them, all while feeling like she was watching herself from a distance. The woman in the emerald dress who was graciously playing the role of the happy wife seemed like a stranger, someone Elena didn't recognize and certainly didn't want to be. The revelation about David's true feelings cast everything about their relationship in a new and horrible light. Elena began to re-examine moments from their marriage that she had interpreted as expressions of love and partnership, wondering how many of them had actually been calculated decisions based on convenience and practical benefit. Had David married her because he genuinely cared about her, or because he recognized that she would be useful to his ambitions? Had their moments of intimacy and connection been real, or had she been projecting emotions onto someone who saw her primarily as a valuable asset? The questions multiplied in Elena's mind as she struggled to maintain her composure through the remainder of their anniversary celebration. She thought about all the times she had prioritized David's needs over her own, convincing herself that this was what marriage required, and that her sacrifices were expressions of love that would be recognized and appreciated by a partner who truly valued her. She remembered giving up her architectural practice, telling herself that she was choosing to support David's dreams because she believed in their shared future and trusted that he would never take her contributions for granted. Elena realized with growing horror that David's casual revelation about convenience had exposed the fundamental inequality that had characterized their entire relationship. While she had been motivated by love, commitment, and genuine partnership, David had been making practical decisions about what worked best for his own goals and ambitions. The asymmetry was devastating, not just because it revealed that David didn't love her the way she loved him, but because it suggested that he had never even bothered to consider whether his feelings might be different from hers. As their guests began to leave and Elena went through the motions of thanking them for coming and expressing hope that they had enjoyed the evening, she found herself wondering how many people had recognized the significance of what David had said. Some of their friends seemed subdued as they said their goodbyes, offering hugs that lasted a little longer than usual, and making comments about how much they valued Elena's friendship. She wondered if they pitied her now, if they would go home and discuss what they had witnessed, if she had become the subject of gossip and speculation in a community where reputation and respect were essential to both personal and professional success. The ride home was silent, with David seemingly oblivious to the devastation he had caused, and Elena too stunned to begin processing what had happened, let alone figure out how to respond to it. She stared out the window at the familiar landscape of Scottsdale, wondering if anything about her life was what she had believed it to be. The house they had built together, the business they had created, the community they had joined, even the son they had raised together suddenly seemed like evidence of a lie she had been living without realizing it. When they arrived home, David headed directly to his office to check emails related to the Sedona Resort project, apparently considering the evening a success and eager to get back to the work that had always been his primary focus. Elena stood in their kitchen, still wearing her emerald dress and diamond earrings, feeling like an actress who had forgotten she was supposed to be playing a role. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a museum of her own naivety, filled with reminders of choices she had made based on assumptions that had been completely wrong. Elena finally understood that David had never seen her as an equal partner in their marriage, despite all the ways she had contributed to their success and all the sacrifices she had made to support his ambitions. She had been useful to him, indispensable even, but useful in the way that a particularly skilled employee might be useful to a demanding boss. The recognition was devastating not just because of what it revealed about David's feelings, but because of what it suggested about her own judgment and her ability to understand the most important relationship in her life. The evening that was supposed to have been a celebration of their partnership had instead become the moment when Elena discovered that their partnership had never existed in the way she had believed. David's casual revelation about convenience had exposed the hollowness at the center of their marriage, and Elena realized that she was facing a choice that would determine the rest of her life. She could continue living the lie that had sustained her for 35 years, or she could find the courage to acknowledge what she had learned and decide what she wanted to do about it. Elena spent the following week moving through her daily routines like someone recovering from a serious illness, going through familiar motions while feeling fundamentally changed by what had happened at their anniversary party. She continued, managing Chen Development's operations with her usual efficiency, coordinating with contractors about ongoing projects and reviewing proposals for new developments. But the work that had once given her satisfaction now felt mechanical and hollow. Every interaction with David felt strained, loaded with the weight of his revelation about convenience, though he seemed to have no awareness of the devastation his words had caused. The phone calls from friends who had attended their anniversary celebration began almost immediately, though none of them directly addressed what David had said during his speech. Instead, they made carefully worded inquiries about how Elena was feeling, mentioned how lovely the party had been, and found reasons to extend invitations for lunch or coffee that felt more like wellness checks than social calls. Elena appreciated their concern, but she found it impossible to discuss what had happened when she was still struggling to understand it herself. The idea that her humiliation had been witnessed by so many people whose respect she valued made the entire situation feel even more unbearable. Margaret Hoffman, Elena's closest friend among the wives of David's business associates, finally called with a directness that cut through the polite circumlocution that had characterized the other conversations. Margaret had known Elena for over 15 years. Ever since their husbands had collaborated on a major office complex development that had strengthened both their companies and cemented a personal friendship between the couples. She had always been someone Elena could talk to honestly about the challenges of being married to driven, ambitious men who sometimes struggled to balance their professional and personal priorities. Margaret's voice carried genuine concern as she asked Elena to meet her for coffee at their usual spot, a quiet cafe in Old Town Scottsdale that provided enough privacy for the kind of conversations that couldn't happen in more public settings. Elena hesitated, knowing that Margaret had witnessed David's speech and would undoubtedly want to discuss what had happened, but she also recognized that she needed to talk to someone who understood the complexities of their social and business community. The isolation she had been feeling since the anniversary party was becoming unbearable, and Margaret's friendship represented one of the few relationships in her life that existed independently of her connection to David. They met on a Tuesday morning when the cafe was relatively quiet, filled mostly with retirees reading newspapers and freelancers working on laptops. Margaret looked elegant as always, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her clothing reflecting the kind of understated sophistication that characterized successful women of their generation. Elena had always admired Margaret's ability to maintain her own identity while supporting her husband's career, and she valued her friend's perspective on the challenges that came with their particular lifestyle and social position. Margaret didn't waste time with small talk, ordering their usual drinks and then leaning forward with an expression of genuine concern that Elena found both comforting and alarming. Her voice was gentle but direct as she asked Elena how she was processing what had happened at the anniversary party, acknowledging that David's speech had been difficult to witness and that she had been worried about Elena ever since that evening. Elena felt tears threaten for the first time since the party, touched by Margaret's straightforward compassion and grateful to finally have someone acknowledge that what had happened was significant and troubling. Elena found herself struggling to articulate the complexity of what she was feeling, the way David's words had recontextualized not just their marriage, but her entire understanding of herself and her choices over the past 35 years. She told Margaret about the growing realization that David had never seen her as an equal partner, despite all the ways she had contributed to their success and all the sacrifices she had made to support his ambitions. The conversation that followed was painful but necessary, as Elena began to voice thoughts and feelings that she had been suppressing since the moment David had spoken those devastating words about convenience. Margaret listened with the kind of focused attention that Elena had forgotten she craved, asking thoughtful questions that helped her examine her situation from different angles and offering observations that came from her own experience, navigating similar challenges in her marriage. Margaret had faced her own struggles with feeling undervalued and taken for granted, though she had found ways to address those issues that had ultimately strengthened her relationship with her husband. Elena found herself envying Margaret's success in maintaining her autonomy and sense of self within her marriage, wondering if it was too late for her to find a similar balance. The conversation revealed that several people at the anniversary party had been disturbed by David's speech, though most of them hadn't known how to respond to what felt like a very public and inappropriate revelation about private matters. Margaret mentioned that her own husband had been shocked by David's casual cruelty, describing it as the kind of thoughtless behavior that revealed fundamental problems in how David understood relationships and emotional responsibility. Elena felt simultaneously vindicated and embarrassed, grateful that others had recognized the significance of what had happened, but mortified that her personal business had become a subject of discussion among their social circle. Margaret's support gave Elena the courage to begin examining other aspects of her relationship with David that she had previously accepted without question. She started noticing the subtle ways that David dismissed her opinions during business meetings, how he took credit for ideas that had originated from their collaborative discussions, and how he seemed to assume that her primary function was to facilitate his success rather than to pursue her own goals and interests. The patterns that had developed over decades of marriage suddenly seemed glaringly obvious, and Elena wondered how she had managed to overlook them for so long. Elena also began paying closer attention to David's interactions with other people, particularly women, and she was disturbed by what she observed. At business events, David displayed a charm and attentiveness toward attractive younger women that was notably different from his interactions with Elena. He would engage in animated conversations with female architects, interior designers, and marketing professionals, showing genuine interest in their ideas and treating them with a respect and consideration that Elena rarely experienced anymore. She realized that David was capable of seeing women as interesting and valuable individuals, but that he had stopped seeing Elena that way years ago. The recognition that David's behavior toward her had changed over time led Elena to examine the evolution of their relationship more carefully. She remembered the early years of their marriage, when David had seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions, when he had sought her advice on important decisions and treated her as an intellectual equal. The shift had been gradual, so subtle that Elena hadn't recognized it was happening, but she could now see how David's increasing success and confidence had corresponded with a declining respect for Elena's contributions and autonomy. Elena began to understand that David's revelation about convenience wasn't an anomaly or a poorly chosen phrase, but rather an honest expression of how he had come to see their relationship. The realization was devastating because it suggested that the deterioration of their marriage hadn't been an accident or a temporary phase, but rather the inevitable result of fundamental differences in how they understood love, partnership, and mutual respect. Elena had been operating under the assumption that marriage required sacrifice and compromise, while David had apparently been making calculations about personal benefit and convenience. The more Elena examined their relationship with this new perspective, the more she recognized patterns of behavior that she had previously interpreted as harmless quirks or temporary stresses, but that now seemed like evidence of deeper problems. David's tendency to make important decisions without consulting her, his assumption that she would be available whenever he needed support or assistance, and his casual dismissal of her own interests and priorities suddenly seemed like manifestations of a fundamental lack of respect for her as an individual rather than simply as his wife and business partner. Elena also began to notice how their social interactions reflected the dynamics of their private relationship. At parties and business events, David would often speak for Elena or redirect conversations away from topics that interested her toward subjects that allowed him to showcase his own knowledge and opinions. She had always attributed this behavior to David's natural confidence and leadership style, but she now recognized it as a form of marginalization that consistently positioned her as secondary to David's presence and importance. The revelation about David's true feelings also made Elena reconsider the sacrifices she had made over the years, particularly her decision to give up her architectural practice to focus on supporting Chen development. What she had understood as a mutual decision based on practical considerations and shared goals now seemed like something she had been manipulated into accepting through David's skillful exploitation of her love and commitment. Elena began to wonder if David had ever genuinely valued her independent career, or if he had always seen it as competition for her attention and energy. Elena found herself spending more time alone, using the excuse of organizing files and updating project schedules to avoid lengthy conversations with David that might reveal the turmoil she was experiencing. She would sit in her home office, surrounded by the meticulously organized records of Chen Development's projects, wondering what her life might have looked like if she had made different choices 35 years ago. The architectural drawings she had saved from her brief independent practice seemed like artifacts from another person's life, evidence of dreams and ambitions that had been gradually eroded by years of putting David's needs first. The isolation Elena felt was compounded by her growing awareness that most of her friendships and social connections were tied to David's business relationships and their shared position within Phoenix's development community. She realized that she had very few relationships that existed independently of her role as David's wife and business partner, and she wondered if people would maintain their friendships with her if she were no longer part of the package deal that included access to David's influence and connections. Elena's relationship with their son Marcus also became a source of anxiety and uncertainty, as she wondered how much he had absorbed from observing his parents' marriage over the years. Marcus was intelligent and perceptive, and Elena worried that he might have learned unhealthy lessons about relationships from watching David's treatment of her become increasingly casual and dismissive. She wondered if Marcus would grow up to treat his own romantic partners the way David treated her, or if he would expect to be served and supported without offering genuine partnership and respect in return. The questions that plagued Elena extended beyond her marriage to encompass her entire sense of identity and purpose. She had spent 35 years defining herself primarily in relation to David and his needs, and she was struggling to remember who she had been before their relationship began to dominate her life so completely. The young woman who had graduated from architecture school with ambitious plans for sustainable development seemed like a character from a story Elena had read long ago, someone whose dreams and aspirations had been gradually abandoned in favor of supporting someone else's vision. Elena began to experience physical symptoms of the stress she was carrying, including headaches, insomnia, and a persistent feeling of nausea that made it difficult to eat regular meals. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom she shared with David, wondering how she had ended up in a marriage that felt more like an elaborate business arrangement than a loving partnership. The man sleeping beside her seemed like a stranger, someone whose casual cruelty had revealed the absence of genuine affection and respect that Elena had somehow failed to notice for decades. David remained oblivious to Elena's distress, continuing to treat their anniversary party as a success and expressing satisfaction with the positive feedback he had received from their guests about Chen Development's continued growth and promising future projects. He seemed to interpret Elena's quieter demeanor as temporary fatigue from the stress of organizing such a large event, and he made occasional comments about how proud he was of her organizational skills and her ability to manage complex social and professional obligations. His praise felt hollow and patronizing, focused on Elena's usefulness rather than her intrinsic worth as a person. The disconnect between David's satisfaction with their situation and Elena's growing despair created an atmosphere of tension that permeated their daily interactions, though David seemed largely unaware of the change. Elena found herself becoming increasingly careful about what she said and how she responded to David's comments, not because she was afraid of conflict, but because she was struggling to maintain the pretense that everything was normal while she processed the magnitude of what she had learned about their relationship. Elena's work at Chen Development began to suffer as she found it increasingly difficult to focus on the details that had always been her specialty. She would sit at her desk, staring at contracts and schedules that seemed to blur together, unable to summon the concentration and dedication that had made her so valuable to the company's operations. The work that had once provided structure and purpose to her life now felt like another manifestation of the fundamental inequality that characterized her relationship with David. As Elena struggled to maintain her composure and continue functioning in her various roles as wife, business partner, and community member, she began to sense that something fundamental had shifted within her that couldn't be reversed or ignored. David's revelation about convenience had opened a door to questions and realizations that were too significant to suppress, and Elena found herself facing the terrifying possibility that she might need to make radical changes to her life if she wanted to preserve any sense of dignity and self-respect. The tension that had been building since their anniversary party was approaching a breaking point, and Elena knew that she would soon need to decide whether to confront David about what he had revealed or continue living with the knowledge that their marriage was built on fundamentally different understandings of love, commitment, and mutual respect. The comfortable routines that had sustained their relationship for decades no longer felt sustainable, and Elena could sense that some kind of reckoning was inevitable. Elena's world shattered completely 3 weeks after their anniversary party, when she discovered the truth that had been hiding beneath David's casual cruelty. It started with a phone call that came to their home office on a Thursday afternoon, while David was supposed to be in meetings with city planners about the Sedona Resort project. Elena answered automatically, expecting another contractor or supplier with questions about ongoing developments, but instead found herself speaking with a woman whose voice carried an unmistakable intimacy when she asked to speak with David. The caller identified herself as Victoria Sterling, and Elena recognized the name immediately from David's stories about his college years and early career. Victoria had been David's girlfriend during their senior year at Arizona State, a talented, interior design student who had shared David's passion for creating beautiful spaces and transforming environments. According to David's version of their history, Victoria had moved to New York after graduation to pursue opportunities in high-end residential design, and they had lost touch when the demands of building their respective careers made maintaining a long-distance relationship impractical. Victoria's voice on the phone carried a warmth and familiarity that made Elena's stomach clench with sudden anxiety. When Elena explained that David wasn't available, Victoria laughed in a way that suggested she was accustomed to being disappointed by David's busy schedule. She mentioned that she had been trying to reach him for several days about finalizing details for their collaboration, and Elena felt a cold dread settle in her chest as she realized that David had never mentioned working with Victoria on any project. Elena managed to maintain her professional composure while taking a message, but her hands were trembling as she wrote down Victoria's contact information and her request that David call her back as soon as possible about the design presentations they needed to complete before next week's investor meeting. The message made it clear that Victoria and David had been working together for some time, collaborating on what sounded like a significant project that required the kind of detailed coordination that Elena had always handled for Chen Development's major developments. After hanging up the phone, Elena sat in stunned silence, trying to process what she had just learned. David had been working with his former girlfriend on what appeared to be an important project, and he had never mentioned Victoria's involvement. To Elena, despite her role in managing the company's operations and her awareness of all their major collaborations, the secrecy felt like another betrayal, particularly in light of David's recent revelation about convenience and his apparent inability to value Elena's contributions to their partnership. Elena's first instinct was to confront David immediately, but she forced herself to consider the situation more carefully before taking any action. Her experience managing complex business negotiations had taught her the importance of gathering complete information before making important decisions, and she realized that she needed to understand the full scope of David's relationship with Victoria before deciding how to respond. The phone call had raised questions that demanded answers, but Elena wanted to make sure she was prepared for whatever she might discover. Elena spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing Chen Development's recent correspondence and project files, looking for any mention of Victoria Sterling or evidence of the collaboration that Victoria had referenced during their phone conversation. What she found was even more disturbing than she had expected. Hidden among routine communications about permits and scheduling were emails between David and Victoria that revealed an ongoing professional relationship that had been deliberately concealed from Elena's oversight. The emails between David and Victoria were ostensibly about business, focusing on design concepts and project specifications for what Elena gradually realized was the Sedona Resort development that had been consuming so much of David's attention in recent months. Victoria had apparently been hired as the lead interior designer for the project, responsible for creating the luxury aesthetic that would distinguish their resort from other high-end destinations in the area. The collaboration made perfect sense from a business perspective, given Victoria's reputation and expertise in exactly the kind of sophisticated design that the project required. But as Elena read through the email exchanges, she began to notice elements that went beyond typical professional communication. David and Victoria wrote to each other with an ease and intimacy that suggested a relationship that extended far beyond their current business collaboration. They referenced shared memories from their college years, made inside jokes that excluded anyone else from their conversations, and expressed appreciation for each other's talents and perspectives in ways that felt more personal than professional. Elena discovered that David and Victoria had been communicating regularly for over 6 months, beginning long before the Sedona project had been officially approved and funded. Their early emails focused on catching up about their respective careers and personal lives, with David sharing details about Chen development's success, and Victoria describing her work with high-profile clients in New York and Los Angeles. The tone of their correspondence was warm and nostalgic, filled with references to their shared past and expressions of regret about losing touch after college. As their email relationship had developed, David and Victoria had begun discussing the possibility of working together on a project that would allow them to combine their respective expertise and create something truly exceptional. Victoria had apparently been looking for an opportunity to expand her practice beyond residential work, while David had been seeking a designer who could help him break into the luxury hospitality market that represented the next phase of Chen Development's growth strategy. Elena realized that the Sedona Resort project had been conceived, at least in part, as a vehicle for David and Victoria to work together and potentially rekindle their personal relationship. The business justification was legitimate, but Elena could see that David's motivations went far beyond professional considerations. He had created an opportunity to spend extensive time with Victoria, collaborating on a project that would require frequent meetings, site visits, and the kind of close cooperation that could easily evolve into something more intimate. The most devastating discovery came when Elena found emails that revealed David and Victoria had been meeting regularly in person, often at restaurants and hotels where they discussed project details over dinner and drinks. David had never mentioned these meetings to Elena, despite his usual practice of keeping her informed about all significant business activities. The secrecy suggested that David was aware that his relationship with Victoria had crossed boundaries that would be inappropriate for a married man, even if their interactions were technically focused on professional matters. Elena found evidence that David had taken Victoria to some of Phoenix's most romantic restaurants, places where he had never taken Elena despite their 35 years of marriage. The expense reports showed charges for expensive wines, multi-course dinners, and late-evening meetings that had clearly extended far beyond the time required for business discussions. Elena realized that David had been essentially dating Victoria while maintaining the pretense that their relationship was purely professional. The timeline of David and Victoria's renewed relationship corresponded exactly with the period when David had become increasingly distant and dismissive toward Elena. His casual cruelty at their anniversary party now seemed like preparation for ending their marriage, a way of establishing that Elena had never been important to him emotionally, and therefore wouldn't be significantly harmed by his decision to pursue a relationship with someone he actually cared about. Elena discovered that Victoria had been in Phoenix for their anniversary party, though she hadn't attended the celebration. Email correspondence showed that David had met with Victoria that very evening, leaving their anniversary party early, to spend time with the woman who represented everything Elena had never been in his eyes. While Elena had been processing the humiliation of David's public revelation about convenience, David had been with Victoria, probably sharing intimate moments and making plans for their future together. The evidence Elena uncovered painted a picture of betrayal that went far beyond emotional infidelity. David had been systematically building a new life with Victoria while maintaining his marriage to Elena for the practical benefits she provided. Elena realized that David's comment about convenience hadn't been a thoughtless revelation, but rather a calculated statement designed to prepare Elena for the end of their marriage, while positioning himself as the honest party who had never misled her about his feelings. Elena spent hours reading through David and Victoria's correspondence, torturing herself with the intimacy and affection that David expressed toward a woman he had supposedly not seen for decades. His emails to Victoria were filled with the kind, of romantic language and emotional vulnerability that he had never shared with Elena, even during the early years of their marriage when she had believed they were genuinely in love. David wrote to Victoria about his dreams, his regrets, and his excitement about their future together with a passion that made it clear that Elena had never inspired similar feelings. The contrast between David's communications with Victoria and his interactions with Elena was devastating. While David wrote to Victoria with warmth, humor, and genuine interest in her thoughts and experiences, his conversations with Elena had become perfunctory and focused on practical matters. Elena realized that David had been saving his emotional energy for Victoria while treating Elena like a household manager, whose primary function was to handle the details that allowed him to focus on more important relationships. Elena discovered that David and Victoria had been making plans that extended far beyond their current business collaboration. Their emails referenced future projects they wanted to work on together, travel they hoped to do, and shared goals that clearly assumed they would be partners in both professional and personal contexts. Elena realized that David had been building a life with Victoria while using Elena's organizational skills and business expertise to create the financial foundation that would support his new relationship. The most painful discovery was an email, where David explicitly told Victoria that he was planning to end his marriage to Elena once the Sedona project was complete and financially successful. He wrote about Elena with casual dismissiveness, describing her as someone who had served her purpose but was no longer necessary for his happiness or success. David's email to Victoria revealed that he saw Elena as an obstacle to overcome rather than a partner whose feelings and welfare deserved consideration. Elena also found evidence that Victoria was fully aware of David's marriage and had been encouraging him to end his relationship with Elena so they could be together openly. Victoria's emails expressed impatience with the secrecy of their relationship and frustration with having to coordinate their meetings around David's obligations to Elena. She wrote about Elena with barely concealed contempt, describing her as someone who was holding David back from achieving his full potential and finding genuine happiness. The correspondence revealed that David and Victoria had been planning to announce their relationship publicly once David had secured the financial benefits of staying married to Elena through the completion of their major projects. Elena realized that she had been working to fund her own abandonment, using her skills and dedication to create the success that would allow David to leave her for the woman he actually wanted to be with. Elena's discovery of David and Victoria's relationship explained so many things that had puzzled her about David's recent behavior. His increased attention to his appearance, his frequent unexplained absences, his growing impatience with Elena's presence at business events, and his casual cruelty about convenience all made perfect sense in the context of a man who was preparing to end his marriage and start a new life with someone else. The revelation that David had been planning their separation for months, while allowing Elena to continue investing her time, energy, and emotional resources in their marriage, felt like the ultimate betrayal. Elena had been living in a relationship that had already ended in David's mind, playing a role in a marriage that existed only for his convenience and financial benefit. The recognition that she had been completely deceived about the most fundamental aspects of her life was devastating, in a way that went beyond simple heartbreak. Elena realized that David's revelation about convenience hadn't been an accidental slip or a moment of thoughtless honesty, but rather a deliberate strategy to begin distancing himself from Elena and preparing her for abandonment. His public humiliation of Elena at their anniversary party had served multiple purposes, establishing his narrative that their marriage had never been based on love, while simultaneously positioning himself as someone who was finally being honest about his feelings rather than someone who was betraying his wife of 35 years. As Elena sat surrounded by the evidence of David's deception and betrayal, she understood that her marriage had ended long before she realized it was in jeopardy. David had been living a double life, maintaining his relationship with Elena for practical reasons while building a new relationship with Victoria, based on the emotional connection and romantic passion that Elena had never been able to inspire in him. The recognition that she had been competing with a ghost for 35 years, losing a contest she didn't even know she was participating in, was almost unbearable. Elena finally understood that David's casual cruelty about convenience had been exactly what it seemed. An honest expression of how he had always seen their relationship, even during the years when Elena had believed they were building something meaningful together. She had been useful to David, essential even, but never loved in the way that she had loved him or in the way that he was apparently capable of loving Victoria. The evidence Elena had uncovered made it impossible to continue pretending that their marriage could be saved, or that David's behavior was a temporary aberration that could be addressed through communication or counseling. David had made his choices deliberately and systematically, building a new life while using Elena's devotion and competence to support his transition. Elena realized that she was facing not just the end of her marriage, but the recognition that the relationship she had spent 35 years building had never existed in the way she had understood it. Elena's understanding of the cruel irony that had defined her entire adult life crystallized as she sat in her home office at 3 a.m, surrounded by the evidence of David's systematic deception. The realization that dawned on her was so profound and devastating that it seemed to rewrite the history of her own existence. For 35 years, she had been living what she believed was a love story, sacrificing her own dreams and ambitions because she thought she was building something beautiful and meaningful with a partner who valued her contributions and cherished their life together. The truth was that she had been playing a supporting role in David's life while he waited for his real leading lady to return. The Sedona Resort project, which David had presented as the culmination of Chen Development's growth and their shared vision for the company's future, had been conceived as something entirely different. Elena discovered through careful examination of David's correspondence with Victoria that the project had been designed from the beginning as a romantic gesture, a way for David to create something beautiful with the woman he had never stopped loving. The luxury spa and resort that Elena had helped plan and organize was intended to be David and Victoria's first major collaboration, a project that would announce their partnership to Phoenix's business community and serve as the foundation for their new life together. Elena realized that every meeting she had attended about the Sedona project, every detail she had organized, every problem she had solved, had been in service of David's plan to replace her with Victoria. The irony was so bitter that Elena almost laughed as she understood how thoroughly she had been manipulated into facilitating her own abandonment. David had used her organizational skills, her business acumen, and her unwavering dedication to create the very opportunity that would allow him to leave her behind. She had been working tirelessly to fund and support the project that would make her obsolete. The architectural plans for the resort told their own story of David's real priorities and the future he had been planning without Elena. Victoria's design concepts were evident throughout the project, from the sophisticated color schemes that reflected her aesthetic preferences to the layout of the spa facilities that incorporated design elements Elena recognized from Victoria's portfolio. David had given Victoria complete creative control over the project that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of Chen Development's achievements, effectively erasing Elena's influence from what should have been her company's most important venture. Elena discovered that David had been using Chen Development's resources to court Victoria in ways that went far beyond their professional collaboration. Company funds had paid for Victoria's extended stays in Phoenix, covering her expenses, at the city's most exclusive hotels and restaurants while she worked on the resort project. David had essentially been using Elena's contributions to the company's success to finance his romantic pursuit of another woman, adding another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. The timeline of David's relationship with Victoria revealed that their reconnection hadn't been the accidental encounter that David had implied in his casual references to working with a designer from his past. Elena found evidence that David had actively sought Victoria out, contacting her through professional networks and deliberately creating opportunities for them to work together. The Sedona project had been conceived specifically as a vehicle for David to reestablish his relationship with Victoria while maintaining the financial stability that his marriage to Elena provided. Elena understood that David's comment about convenience at their anniversary party hadn't been a spontaneous revelation, but rather a calculated statement designed to prepare their social circle for the end of their marriage. By publicly establishing that he had never loved Elena, David was positioning himself as someone who was finally being honest about his feelings rather than someone who was betraying a devoted wife. The cruelty of the statement had been intentional, designed to humiliate Elena and make their eventual divorce seem like the inevitable result of an incompatible relationship, rather than David's selfish betrayal. The emails between David and Victoria revealed that they had been planning the end of David's marriage with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized their business collaborations. They had discussed the timing of their public announcement, the financial arrangements that would need to be made, and the impact that David's divorce would have on Chen Development's operations. Elena realized that she had been the subject of their strategic planning, discussed and analyzed like a business problem that needed to be managed, rather than a human being whose feelings and welfare deserved consideration. Elena discovered that Victoria had been advising David on how to minimize Elena's financial claims in their divorce, suggesting strategies for protecting Chen Development's assets and limiting Elena's ability to demand compensation for her decades of contributions to the company's success. The woman who was replacing Elena in David's life had been actively working to ensure that Elena would be left with as little as possible when David finally decided to end their marriage. The betrayal felt complete, encompassing not just emotional abandonment, but deliberate financial sabotage. The correspondence revealed that David and Victoria had been laughing about Elena's dedication to the Sedona project, amused by her enthusiasm for a development that was designed to facilitate her own replacement. They had made jokes about Elena's organizational skills and her attention to detail, qualities that David had publicly praised but privately mocked with the woman who was going to take Elena's place in his life. Elena realized that her contributions to Chen Development's success had been the subject of David and Victoria's private entertainment, discussed with the casual cruelty that characterized people who saw others as objects rather than human beings, with feelings and dignity. Elena found evidence that David had been sharing intimate details about their marriage with Victoria, describing Elena's personality, her habits, and her emotional needs with the detached analysis of someone discussing a business associate rather than a life partner. David had violated Elena's privacy and dignity by making their most personal moments the subject of his conversations with another woman, treating Elena's vulnerabilities and insecurities as material for Victoria's amusement and reassurance about her own superiority. The emails revealed that Victoria had been encouraging David to be increasingly cruel to Elena, suggesting that making Elena unhappy would make their eventual separation easier for everyone involved. Victoria had advised David to withdraw his emotional support from Elena, to become more critical of her contributions, and to generally make Elena feel unwelcome in her own marriage. Elena realized that the growing distance and hostility she had sensed from David hadn't been the result of stress or temporary difficulties, but rather a deliberate campaign to push her away and make her grateful for whatever scraps of attention and respect David was willing to provide. Elena discovered that David and Victoria had been planning their new life together with the same enthusiasm and attention to detail that Elena had once brought to planning her own future with David. They had discussed the cities where they wanted to live, the projects they wanted to work on together, and the kind of lifestyle they hoped to create as a couple. Reading about their shared dreams and aspirations felt like discovering that David was capable of the kind of partnership and emotional intimacy that Elena had always craved, but had never been able to inspire in him. The most devastating revelation was that David had told Victoria about Elena's abandoned architectural career, describing it as evidence of Elena's lack of ambition and her willingness to settle for a supporting role, rather than pursuing her own dreams. David had rewritten the history of Elena's sacrifice, presenting her decision to give up her practice as proof of her limited vision rather than as evidence of her love and commitment to their shared success. Elena realized that David had been using her greatest act of love as evidence of her inadequacy, twisting her sacrifice into a justification for his betrayal. Elena found emails where David expressed relief at finally being able to work with someone who shared his creative vision and professional ambitions, contrasting Victoria's talents and sophistication with Elena's more practical contributions to Chen development. David had written about feeling intellectually and creatively stifled by his marriage to Elena, describing her as someone who was useful for managing details, but lacked the imagination and aesthetic sensibility that he needed in a true partner. The casual dismissal of Elena's intelligence and capabilities felt like another knife wound, particularly painful because it came from someone who had benefited enormously from Elena's skills and dedication. The correspondence revealed that David and Victoria had been planning to use Elena's organizational systems and business contacts to launch their own independent design and development company, essentially stealing the infrastructure that Elena had spent decades building for Chen development. They had discussed which clients they could take with them, which contractors would be willing to work with their new venture, and how they could leverage Elena's relationships for their own benefit. Elena realized that she had not only been funding her own replacement, but had also been building the foundation for David and Victoria's new business at the expense of her own future security. Elena discovered that David had been preparing to claim that Elena's contributions to Chen development had been minimal, and that her role in the company's success had been exaggerated. He had been creating a paper trail that would support his claim that Elena had been more of a secretary than a true business partner, deliberately undermining documentation of her actual responsibilities and achievements. Elena realized that David was planning to rewrite the history of their partnership to minimize her financial claims in their divorce, while maximizing his own apparent contributions to the company's success. The emails between David and Victoria revealed their shared contempt for Elena's attempts to maintain the facade of their marriage, describing her efforts to organize their anniversary party and celebrate their relationship as pathetic and delusional. They had been amused by Elena's obvious pride in their supposed partnership and her apparent blindness to the reality of David's feelings. Elena understood that while she had been planning their anniversary celebration as a genuine expression of love and gratitude, David had been viewing it as an opportunity to publicly humiliate her and establish his narrative about their relationship. Elena found evidence that Victoria had been present in Phoenix during their anniversary party, staying at a hotel just miles from the resort where Elena had been celebrating what she thought was a milestone in their marriage. David had left their anniversary celebration early to spend the night with Victoria, abandoning Elena to process his cruel revelation about convenience while he was with the woman who represented everything Elena had never been in his eyes. The timing of David's betrayal was so precisely calculated that Elena realized he had planned every aspect of that evening to maximize her humiliation while minimizing his own discomfort. The correspondence revealed that David and Victoria had been discussing Elena's likely reaction to their eventual announcement, speculating about whether she would fight the divorce or accept it gracefully. They had made plans for handling Elena's emotional response, discussing strategies for managing her potential anger, and ensuring that she wouldn't be able to damage their reputations or interfere with their new relationship. Elena realized that her own emotional welfare had been reduced to a strategic consideration in David and Victoria's planning, another obstacle to be managed rather than a legitimate concern that deserved compassion and respect. Elena discovered that David had been sharing details about their intimate life with Victoria, describing Elena's emotional needs and physical insecurities with the casual cruelty of someone discussing an annoying roommate rather than a wife of 35 years. David had violated every boundary of privacy and respect that should have existed between married partners, treating Elena's most vulnerable moments as material for his entertainment with another woman. The betrayal felt complete, encompassing not just emotional and financial abandonment, but also the destruction of Elena's dignity and self-respect. The emails revealed that Victoria had been encouraging David to see Elena as an obstacle to his happiness rather than a partner who deserved consideration and respect. Victoria had reinforced David's sense of entitlement to pursue his own desires without regard for Elena's feelings or welfare, framing Elena's pain as an acceptable cost of David's authentic self-expression. Elena realized that Victoria hadn't just been David's romantic interest, but had also been his accomplice in justifying behavior that any decent person would recognize as cruel and unacceptable. Elena found evidence that David and Victoria had been planning to announce their relationship at the completion of the Sedona Resort project, using Elena's greatest professional achievement as the backdrop for revealing her personal betrayal. They had discussed the symbolic significance of launching their new partnership at the resort that Elena had helped create, seeing it as a poetic justice that would establish their new beginning while definitively ending David's obligations to his old life. Elena realized that every aspect of the Sedona project had been contaminated by David's deception, turning what should have been a source of pride into a monument to her own naivety and exploitation. The correspondence revealed the full scope of David's long-term planning and the calculating nature of his betrayal. Elena understood that nothing about their marriage had been what she believed it to be, that David had been living a double life with a sophistication and cruelty that she would never have imagined him capable of. The man she had loved and supported for 35 years had been systematically destroying her life while using her own contributions to fund and facilitate his betrayal. Elena realized that the cruel irony of her situation extended beyond simply being replaced by David's first love. She had been used to build the very foundation that would support David's new life without her, contributing her skills, energy, and resources to create the success that would allow David to abandon her without financial consequences. Elena had been working against her own interests for years without realizing it, strengthening David's position while weakening her own ability to survive independently. The recognition that Elena had been living in a completely fabricated reality was devastating in a way that went beyond simple heartbreak. She had based every major decision of her adult life on assumptions that were completely false, sacrificing her own dreams and ambitions for a partnership that had never existed except in her own imagination. Elena understood that she had been alone in her marriage for decades without realizing it, loving someone who saw her as a useful tool rather than a cherished partner. As Elena sat surrounded by the evidence of David's systematic deception and betrayal, she realized that her life had been built on a foundation of lies so complete that nothing about her existence was what she had believed it to be. The cruel irony was that Elena's greatest strengths, her loyalty, dedication, and selfless love, had been the very qualities that David had exploited most effectively. She had been punished for being exactly the kind of partner that any decent person would treasure, used, and discarded because her virtues made her easy to manipulate and exploit. Elena understood that David's revelation about convenience hadn't been an accidental slip or a moment of thoughtless honesty, but the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign to destroy her sense of self-worth while positioning himself as the victim of an incompatible marriage. The cruelty was so systematic and complete that Elena realized she was dealing with someone whose capacity for deception and manipulation went far beyond ordinary selfishness or thoughtlessness. The evidence Elena had discovered made it impossible to salvage any positive memories from their 35 years together, because she now understood that even their happiest moments had been contaminated by David's fundamental dishonesty about his feelings and intentions. Elena realized that she had been living with a stranger who had been skilled enough to maintain a facade of partnership and affection while planning her destruction with methodical precision. Elena spent the entire weekend alone in their house while David was supposedly attending a construction industry conference in Las Vegas, though she now suspected he was actually with Victoria planning their future together. The silence that filled their home felt different now. No longer the comfortable quiet of a secure marriage, but the hollow emptiness of a life built on deception. Elena moved through the rooms she had once loved, seeing everything with new eyes that recognized the fundamental falseness of what she had believed was her sanctuary and foundation. The house itself seemed to mock Elena's naivety as she examined details that now carried different meanings. The family photographs that lined the hallways told the story of a marriage that had never existed the way Elena remembered it. Looking at pictures from their early years together, Elena could now see what she had missed at the time. David's smiles in those photographs had never reached his eyes when he looked at her, and his body language consistently suggested someone who was performing a role rather than expressing genuine affection. Elena realized that even during what she had considered their happiest moments, David had been maintaining emotional distance that she had somehow failed to recognize. Their wedding photographs, which Elena had always treasured as evidence of their love and commitment, now revealed David's fundamental detachment from the ceremony and the promises he was making. Elena could see that David had been going through the motions of marriage without ever truly investing himself in the relationship or committing to the partnership that Elena thought they were creating together. The architectural drawings Elena had saved from her abandoned practice seemed to taunt her from their storage boxes in the garage, representing dreams and ambitions that she had sacrificed for a man who had never valued her contributions or respected her potential. Elena spent hours looking through her old designs, remembering the passion and excitement she had felt about sustainable architecture and innovative residential developments. The young woman who had created those drawings had possessed confidence and vision that Elena had gradually surrendered over decades of prioritizing David's needs over her own aspirations. Elena began to understand that her decision to abandon her architectural career hadn't been the mutual choice she had remembered, but rather the result of David's subtle manipulation and emotional pressure. David had never explicitly demanded that Elena give up her practice, but he had created circumstances that made it increasingly difficult for her to maintain her own professional identity while also serving his growing demands for support and assistance. Elena realized that David had systematically undermined her confidence in her own abilities while increasing her dependence on his approval and validation. The financial records Elena examined revealed another layer of David's long-term deception and planning. Chen Development's corporate structure had been deliberately designed to minimize Elena's legal claims to the company's assets, despite her decades of contributions to its success. David had worked with attorneys and accountants to ensure that Elena's role in the company was documented as that of an employee rather than a true partner, even though her actual responsibilities and contributions far exceeded what any employee would typically provide. Elena discovered that David had been systematically reducing her official authority within Chen Development while maintaining her actual workload and responsibilities. Her business cards and official titles had been gradually downgraded over the years, while David ensured that external contracts and legal documents reflected his sole ownership and control of the company. Elena had been so focused on the day-to-day operations of their business that she had failed to notice how David was legally erasing her from the partnership they had supposedly built together. The financial arrangements David had made for their personal assets revealed similar manipulation and preparation for abandonment. Their house, which Elena had designed and considered their shared achievement, was titled solely in David's name, despite Elena's contributions to both its design and financing. David had gradually transferred other significant assets into his individual control, using Elena's own organizational skills to facilitate legal maneuvers that would ultimately leave her with minimal financial security when he decided to end their marriage. Elena realized that David's discussions about retirement planning and their financial future had been deliberate deceptions designed to encourage Elena to make decisions that would benefit David's long-term security while undermining her own. David had convinced Elena to consolidate their assets in ways that appeared to simplify their financial management, but actually concentrated control in David's hands while reducing Elena's independent access to resources she had helped create. The recognition that Elena had been financially manipulated as well as emotionally betrayed added another dimension to her growing understanding of David's calculated cruelty. Elena had trusted David completely with their financial planning, believing that their shared interests meant that David would naturally protect her welfare along with his own. The discovery that David had been deliberately structuring their assets to facilitate her abandonment felt like another profound violation of the trust and partnership that Elena had believed defined their relationship. Elena's examination of their social relationships revealed how David had been gradually isolating her from independent sources of support and validation. Most of Elena's friendships were connected to David's business relationships, meaning that her social network was dependent on her continued marriage and David's willingness to include her in their shared professional community. Elena realized that David had discouraged her from maintaining relationships that existed independently of their marriage, subtly undermining her connections with former colleagues and classmates who might have provided perspective on her situation. The few independent friendships Elena had maintained, like her relationship with Margaret Hoffman, had been weakened by Elena's increasing focus on David's needs and her growing isolation from activities and interests that didn't directly serve their marriage and business partnership. Elena understood that David had benefited from her social isolation, which made her more dependent on his approval and less likely to seek outside perspective on their relationship dynamics. Elena began to see how David's control over their social calendar had served his interests while limiting her opportunities for independent relationships and activities. David had consistently prioritized business events and social obligations that served Chen Development's interests, while discouraging Elena's participation in activities that might have provided her with independent sources of satisfaction and self-worth. Elena realized that she had been gradually transformed from someone with her own interests and aspirations into someone whose entire identity was defined by her relationship to David and his success. The isolation Elena had experienced wasn't accidental, but rather the result of David's systematic effort to make her completely dependent on him for social connection, financial security, and personal validation. Elena understood that David had created circumstances that would make it extremely difficult for her to leave their marriage or challenge his authority within their relationship. The manipulation had been so gradual and subtle that Elena had never recognized it as a deliberate strategy designed to maintain David's control while minimizing his obligations and responsibilities. Elena's growing awareness of David's manipulation extended to their relationship with their son Marcus, whom David had clearly been preparing to serve as an ally in any potential conflict with Elena. David's casual attitude toward Marcus's academic and personal development had served multiple purposes, establishing David as the permissive and understanding parent while positioning Elena as the demanding and unreasonable one. Elena realized that David had been undermining her authority as a parent while building a relationship with Marcus that would serve David's interests if their marriage ended. The conversations Elena remembered having with Marcus about his future and his responsibilities now seemed different when viewed through the lens of David's long-term planning. David had consistently encouraged Marcus to see Elena's concerns as excessive and her expectations as unrealistic, subtly teaching their son to dismiss Elena's judgment and value David's more relaxed approach to parenting and life planning. Elena understood that David had been preparing Marcus to side with him in any family conflict, while simultaneously training their son to see women as sources of unnecessary pressure and limitation. Elena realized that David's parenting strategy had been designed to ensure that Marcus would not provide Elena with emotional support or validation if their marriage ended. David had systematically undermined Elena's relationship with their son, creating circumstances where Marcus was more likely to see Elena as the problem in their family rather than recognizing David's manipulation and betrayal. Elena understood that she had lost her son's respect and support through David's careful management of their family dynamics. The recognition that David had been manipulating their son as well as their marriage filled Elena with a rage that was different from the hurt and betrayal she had been experiencing. Elena realized that David's willingness to damage Marcus's relationship with his mother in order to protect his own interests revealed a level of selfishness and cruelty that went beyond ordinary marital infidelity. David had been willing to harm their child's emotional development and family relationships to serve his own convenience and control. Elena's anger began to transform into something harder and more determined as she fully grasped the scope of David's deception and the systematic nature of his betrayal. The hurt and confusion that had initially overwhelmed her was giving way to a cold fury that came from understanding exactly how she had been used and manipulated over decades of what she had believed was a loving partnership. Elena realized that David's treatment of her hadn't been the result of growing apart or incompatibility, but rather the predictable outcome of a relationship where one person had never seen the other as fully human. The evidence Elena had gathered revealed that David was capable of a level of deception and manipulation that most people would find difficult to sustain over decades. Elena understood that she had been living with someone whose fundamental character was so different from what she had believed that she might as well have been married to a complete stranger. The David she had loved and supported for 35 years had never existed except in her own imagination and hopes. Elena's transformation from devastated victim to determined survivor began as she realized that David's greatest mistake had been underestimating her intelligence and strength. David had assumed that Elena's love and loyalty made her weak and easily controlled. But Elena began to understand that the same qualities that had made her vulnerable to David's manipulation could also provide her with the foundation for rebuilding her life on her own terms. Elena's capacity for dedication and hard work, which David had exploited, could also be channeled toward her own goals and independence. The skills Elena had developed during her decades of managing Chen Development's operations were substantial and transferable, despite David's attempts to minimize her contributions and present her as merely an assistant or secretary. Elena realized that she possessed expertise in project management, client relations, financial planning, and business operations that would be valuable in many different contexts. Elena understood that David's success had been built on her competence and dedication, which meant that she was capable of creating success for herself if she could find the courage to start over. Elena began to see that David's revelation about convenience, while devastating, had also been a gift that freed her from continuing to waste her life on someone who would never value her contributions or respect her worth as a human being. Elena realized that David had actually done her a favor by revealing his true feelings so clearly that she couldn't continue to deceive herself about the nature of their relationship or the possibility of creating genuine partnership with someone who saw her as merely useful rather than lovable. The strength Elena began to feel wasn't the result of anger alone, but came from a growing recognition of her own value and capabilities that had been obscured by decades of focusing on David's needs and goals. Elena understood that she had been so busy supporting David's success that she had forgotten her own potential and lost sight of what she might be capable of achieving on her own behalf. The woman who had once designed innovative architectural solutions and managed complex business operations was still there, waiting to be rediscovered and unleashed. Elena's gathering strength was also fueled by a growing sense of anticipation about the possibility of finally living authentically, pursuing her own interests and goals without having to consider how they might affect David's convenience or serve his ambitions. Elena realized that she had been living a constrained and diminished version of herself for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to make decisions based on her own desires and values rather than someone else's expectations and demands. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.